Welcome to Justice Talks. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm going to be talking about when coping becomes criminal. And I'm joined by guests that I've had on the show many times. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
I'm Leonard James Hassan, I'm a sergeant with the St. Petersburg Police Department.
All right. Thank you for joining me today. So, today we're talking about when coping becomes criminal. And last time you were on the podcast, we started to kind of get into this idea about behaviors that people have. And so when we're talking about criminal behaviors, specifically with regard to like coping, we're talking about, drug and alcohol use. And
Mhm.
when law enforcement intervene, when law enforcement respond to those calls, we're talking about behaviors that are violent, right?
Right,
Whether that's like domestic violence or that's actually a violent offense.
right.
Somebody attacks someone or rapes someone or, hurts someone in some capacity. But what we don't often look at is what's going on behind the scenes that prompts that involvement,
Right.
right? And so if maybe you could start by giving us some examples of when law enforcement become involved or are called to these scenes, what are kind of the patterns that you see of what's
Mhm.
going on that elicits a response, elicits your need to be there?
Okay. Well, if we're going to start with the criminal behavior that is obviously generally why we're responding, and you make a good example with just domestic violence, and I say it's a good example only in that it's unfortunately quite common, and you see a lot of the different indicators from several different types of reasons that we might get called out, different types of call types. They can all be kind of jumbled up into domestic violence
Mm,
because we see all of it within that. And so,
yeah.
a relatively typical response would be neighbors hear someone fighting in the next house over,
Mhm.
right? A lot of yelling, a lot of screaming. Maybe they hear something breaking, whatever else. And so they call law enforcement, hey, you can go check on these folks. And so we we'll approach, we'll knock on the door. One of the parties involved will answer, and sometimes there's going to be an obvious injury the moment they open the door, whether they were punched in the face or seriously hurt some other way. We're going to be able to tell. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes it's a matter of trying to convince them to talk to us. Hey, you know, we were called out here for this reason. Can we please talk to you? We want to make sure everybody's okay. Most of the time, I would say, people are generally like, okay, yeah, we'll talk to you. And so as we start talking to them, we realize, okay, yeah, this subject, who we call a suspect, struck this subject, we would now call the victim, right? And that's what the victim is telling me. The victim's telling me, yeah, my husband and I were in an argument, and over, I don't know, money's a pretty common issue, right? And it got heated, and he reached over and, grabbed my hair and threw me down on the ground.
Mhm.
So nothing super horrendous, but obviously a violent outburst. And
Yeah.
so in that right away, like, okay, well, there's a money issue, right? So they're not, somebody's not managing finances properly. They're not managing finances well as a team, as a couple. And then the violent outburst is also showing, that he's got an anger control problem, right? Because obviously, he's physically lashed out
Yeah.
on his wife. And so, but obviously we're just there to kind of figure it out, and then we'll go talk to him. Sometimes they end up admitting, yeah, I kind of lost my temper and I grabbed her, which would then give us the probable cause to arrest. Or maybe she's got an injury, maybe she's got that mark on her face or something that's corroborates or at least substantiates um, what her statement is. And so, but then as we continue to talk to them, then we'll find out, well, he's also an alcoholic, right?
Mm.
And he's abusing alcohol. And you'd be amazed at what some folks will tell us, and then we'll find out, well, he's an alcoholic because he lost his job 6 months ago. Well, he lost his job 6 months ago because he's been having some mental health issues and depression because his mother died 2 years ago, right?
Mhm.
And so you dig into some of this stuff. Now, none of this excuses obviously
Right.
the behavior itself, but you start to realize, as a young officer, you're just looking at, okay, I've got a call. I'm going to investigate this thing. I figure out what it is. Okay, I got a crime. Now I got to see, do I have enough to arrest? Okay, I got enough to arrest. That's where a younger
Yeah.
officer's mind is at. And one of the things that we are trying to do now is kind of show them, like, look, yes, that's all. what we need to focus on because that's the basic job. But when we're dealing with these people, we have to keep in mind that yes, they had this violent outburst, they committed this crime, but there are a lot of underlying factors as
Right.
what got them to that point.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point because that's something that really kind of happens in society when all of these things are going on, the behind the scenes suffering that's occurring, right?
Hmm.
People are dealing with their own mental health challenges, whether that's depression or anxiety that's, initiated by some event that happened or it's an underlying mental health issue. People tend to look for ways to deal with that, right?
Mm.
We call that coping. And when law enforcement are called to these situations, it's because people are participating or utilizing maladaptive coping practices, right? And so
Right.
when we talk about maladaptive coping, we're talking about things that cause harm not just to the individual, but the family unit as well as the community in some capacity, right?
Right.
So they're using drugs, they're using alcohol to cope. They may become violent because they're dealing with a lot of aggression and anger. So they cope in that way. They have those violent outbursts. There are people that go out and try to alleviate their problems by stealing, right? And so
Hmm.
these are just different ways of coping. But we often, as a society, only really pay attention to the visible, right?
Right.
We look at, okay, well, law enforcement were called. These individuals broke the law. They need to be punished. They need to be held accountable. And that's the focus, right?
Right.
We often don't start to look backwards and look at what's going on behind the scenes. And in the scenario that you kind of presented us with, where, suspect is dealing with all of this suffering that's going on,
Hmm.
and the victim is the one that's basically taking what's that suffering is, right? It's
Right.
becoming the virtual punching bag or literal punching bag, right?
Right.
And we focus all of our attention and energy on providing supports to the victim.
Correct.
We tend to ignore the invisible
Hmm.
that causes law enforcement intervention, right?
Right.
And so we want to work backwards and kind of look at what is going on behind this event that
Hmm.
happened to identify where maladaptive coping is taking place and understand the suffering that's going on, because that's what's really going on. Because as law enforcement, you're called to deal with all of the problems,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Whenever there is a violence issue, you're called. When there's a substance abuse issue, you're called.
Mhm.
Whenever they don't know how to handle a juvenile, they're called.
And that's what I think some folks don't realize too is we don't always get called just for because a perceived crime has been or is being committed, right? We also respond to, I mean, we have call titles like civil disturbance or neighborhood dispute. Um, and so, or we call it not civil disturbance, I'm sorry, it's civil issue is
Hmm.
just what it's called. And so it could just be two neighbors beefing over a tree that's,
Yeah.
straddling their property, or as you brought up, the juvenile. We get that actually quite a lot where essentially folks are calling police to come parent their child for
Hmm.
them. And and a lot of that also goes back to, we're talking about maladaptive coping skills or just the straight up, what I would just call lack of coping skills, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so you show up and you get this call. It's like, hey, I've got my 12-year-old kid and he is refusing to go to school and he just broke a bunch of stuff in the house and he's throwing this temper tantrum and I just can't deal with him anymore. Y'all need to come do something. Okay.
Hmm.
So, we'll show up. Obviously, we always show up with a couple officers. So one officer will pull the kid aside for a minute and talk to him. And then I'll go talk to the parent or parents, about what's going on. And as you as you have the conversation with them, you start to realize that, well, they haven't really set a whole lot of hard boundaries
Hmm.
with the kids, or and it's not anything they're doing wrong per se. It's just, they're trying to be good parents. They are trying to give the kids some latitude and all the stuff. But I think sometimes they take it too far, or the kid has an underlying mental
Hmm.
health issue where they need different
Yeah.
strategies and maybe the child has not been diagnosed yet, right?
Hmm.
And so, you've got all those underlying, those underlying issues, and you're talking to the parents, and you're like, okay, well, what is it that you want to see here? And it's like, well, um, we want you to scare them. What do you mean you
Mm.
want me to scare them? We want you
Mm.
to scare our kids straight. It's like, okay, that
Mm.
like the study's been
Like
done. Like
fear them into
fear
control.
them into control. Like
Yeah.
I have had parents ask me, "Can you just put them in handcuffs and throw them in the back of the cruiser just to just like I'm like, no, we're not
Like a scared straight.
like a scared straight kind of thing. Like,
Yeah.
no, we're not going to do that, right?
Yeah.
Um, because of course that can also end up causing a young kid now be terrified of police. Now, if that kid needs help out in
Mhm.
the world and he sees a cop, I want him to be okay going and speaking
Mhm.
to that cop, right?
Yeah.
So obviously we're not going to do that kind of thing. But you talk to them and you just start to realize, okay, there's no hard set boundaries, there's no consistency and discipline. Um, the
And you're identifying effective coping, right?
right.
On how we handle situations, how we handle
Hmm.
experiences. So
Yeah.
we learn how to set boundaries. We
Yeah.
learn how to create guidelines for people. And
Right.
this isn't just applied to like juvenile parent relationship.
Right.
This applies to all relationships. And
Hmm.
there's a breakdown, and that's where law enforcement involvement kind of comes up.
Right. And so this one juvenile call becomes kind of a microcosm of multiple different things that can be going on, because
Mhm.
we may not be getting into mom and dad's own personal issues yet,
Right.
right? Which
Yeah.
can affect
Hmm.
how they parent and what the environment in the household is. And and so then you go talk to the child, and they'll tell you, well, mom wouldn't let me have chocolate candy this morning, and that's why I'm mad. And okay, so you threw a chair into the cabinet and
Hmm.
broke the cabinet? Like, that's your response to it? And if you dig deep enough, you'll come to find out, well, dad lashes out too when he's angry. He
Hmm.
throws stuff or he bangs stuff. So it's a learned behavior.
Yeah, this is a violent maladaptive coping behavior that like and what you point out is like it is handed down, yeah, but in not the sense that we think of as handed down, as more so it's emulated. We're people and
Hmm.
we are sponges. We do what we see. We learn from other people. And so
Hmm.
if mom and dad don't have effective coping mechanisms, they don't
Yep.
use adaptive coping, then how can we expect children?
Right. And none of this is to, exclude, myself of any of this. I am not perfect either,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
I've snapped at my kids, and then I
Mhm.
will see, particularly in one of my children, that she now will yell
Mhm.
when she gets frustrated or angry. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, I know where she learned that from. And so, for me, it was, it's been kind of a not a trigger, but just kind of, okay, I need to work on this,
An
because
awareness.
it's awareness. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Mhm.
That yes, I need to work on this to show her a better way of handling
Yeah.
frustration.
And that's a process that what you're highlighting is that we hope that people have, but not
Right.
everyone.
And not everybody does, and that's why law enforcement ends up getting involved in
Mhm.
a lot of instances, because we have individuals that they don't have those skills. I mean, I can
Yeah.
remember being a 29-year-old brand new officer out on the street,
Yeah.
and I get another, domestic, because that's a pretty standard thing for us, and I'm talking to a 65-year-old man trying to give him advice on his toxic relationship, because he's being arrested for the fourth time in 3 years, being accused of striking the same woman.
Mhm.
Now she keeps dropping the charges, but it's like, it became a very surreal moment for me
Yeah.
as a person, because I'm like, I am in no condition to be giving you
Yeah.
marriage advice.
But you bring up a good point though, because it's it's not that age is what teaches us
Right.
effective coping mechanisms,
Mm-mm.
right? It's a learning process, quite literally,
Yeah.
you know. And also like in our culture, in our society, we don't really have an effective program where we teach people,
Mm.
like if you think about like our education in our schools, we're not teaching effective
Mm-mm.
coping mechanisms. We're basically telling people to deal with it, to
Right.
find a way to deal with it. We're not offering suggestions, we're not offering advice, we're not giving you a game plan. We're just saying deal with it.
No, and there are times when we get called out to these different instances where, again, when I was a younger officer, I'm trying to I didn't have a kid.
Mhm.
and I'm trying to give parental advice to, a 50-year-old dad who has two 12-year-old kids, a 10 and 12-year-old kid,
Mhm.
but he's having a difficult time handling them. And so, you offer resources, you say, hey, maybe try this instead of that or whatever else, because in that moment,
You feel
you're what he's
in
got.
yeah, you're what he has, but you also kind of feel like you don't have the legitimacy.
And yes. And
But I think that, like what we're saying is it's not necessarily about this legitimate position that we hold, whether we're a parent or not,
right.
right? That gives us credibility in our ability to say, here are some effective ways.
And it doesn't. I mean, for me, I'm 43 years old now. I've had my struggles in life. I didn't start this career until I was, like I said, 28, 29 years old, because I had some maladaptive coping skills. And so I struggled for a while until
Mhm.
I was able to get myself to a place where I was more stable. And was like, okay, this is what I need to do to get myself moving forward. I was lucky enough to have that happen, but not a lot of people don't have that.
So can you kind of work through maybe a little bit of like, you don't have to name anything if you don't want
Right.
to, but just kind of like, how did that process evolve for you? Because I think that we all as individuals go through that, right? We all have at some point in our life, and that's the thing I think that's an important point to make is there are not people that are always adaptively coping,
Right.
that just never utilize maladaptive coping,
Right.
right? We all go through effective and ineffective ways of coping.
Right.
And, sometimes we, struggle more than others. And so I think that we've all kind of practiced maladaptive coping in some capacity, but
Hmm.
we don't really ever talk about, like, what does that look like? How did you identify that these are things that you needed to change? And then what did you do to change those?
All right. So I was abused as a kid. Like my dad was kind of a jerk.
Mhm.
And so there were a lot of issues back then in where my self
Mm,
worth and value was diminished quite a
mhm.
bit.
Yeah.
And so as I grew up and got into high school, it became a matter of I started finding validation in other relationships,
Mhm.
right? And romantic relationships, especially going into late high school and then also, when I went into college. And so I became too focused on, well, if I don't have a girlfriend, then that's because I'm not lovable or I'm not worthy. And so
Mm.
then it becomes where I would go into these depressions, and instead of getting my schoolwork done, I'm lamenting or, I mean, I'm trying to go on match.com or
Yeah.
something to try to, find some way to connect with somebody to make
Yeah.
myself feel better. And and so that became a struggle, and that continued through, my mid 20s. I ended up leaving college, didn't finish that degree because I couldn't focus on it.
Mm.
And I end up in a relationship that was quite toxic in that, um, I was trying to base my own worth
Yeah.
on how she felt about me, but she was quite selfish and narcissistic, which
Mhm.
is generally what you'll see in a
Yeah.
lot of those relationships. That's usually you got the person that has no self-worth and the narcissist. That's usually the
The empath
relationship.
and the narcissist.
Correct. Because that's the
Yeah.
relationship you're going to
Mhm.
see. And eventually, I got to a point where I'm 25 years old living with my mom.
Mhm.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing
Mhm.
if I feel like if you're trying to advance yourself, but I was kind of stuck in a rut. I was in what I considered dead end relationship. I was in what I considered a dead end job. I worked for a small boating company as a boat captain, doing eco tours and things like that, which in and of itself is fun. And again, it's not a
Yeah.
bad career if you're going to advance it. But I was in a position that I didn't know how to advance it or where I was going to go. So I joined the Navy Reserves.
Mhm.
I finally got to a point like I've got to do something to kick myself in the butt to move forward in life.
Was it you were kind of just done with the suffering?
Yeah, I was just had it. I felt like I was in a dead end. I didn't know where I was going. I was 26 years old by this time,
Mm.
and I have friends that have already, finished their degrees and they're already onto their careers and they're already starting, some of them are starting families, some of them are doing all these different things. And while no, we shouldn't like my life is my life and I shouldn't
Mhm.
compare it, but at the same time, it's like, but this is not where I want to be either. Like there is something I do want
So there
more
was
for my
something inside of
life.
you. You would say it's more like your own personal characteristics of who you are that really kind of brought about that change for you.
Well, there's that. There's, my mom, is my mom was my support system. So
Mhm.
she was pushing me. And so, I figured, okay, this is what I want to do. I want to become a cop one day. I don't want to live like this anymore, but I need
Mhm.
something to jumpstart it. And so that's why
Yeah.
I joined the Naval Reserves. And then from there, I was able to kind of get my
Yeah.
crap together. Right. But
You
n-
started your process of healing.
I started my process and I'm still going through
Yeah.
that process.
Yeah.
I still, and then,
Mhm.
but then you join something like law enforcement. Right. And I know you've talked about this in other class, another podcast where, okay, well, I've got my own trauma that I'm dealing with from my past, whether it be, bad relationships or whatever else. And now I'm exposing myself
Yeah.
to everybody else's trauma. So it's a constant process. I think that's the other thing that a lot of people think like, I'm going to go get a certain medication or do a certain type of therapy or do this or that, and I'm good.
Yeah.
And it's not how it works. Like
No.
it's always a process. It's learning new coping skills. And but not everybody has those opportunities. Like there's a lot of people, especially that get to a point that they're calling law enforcement for different things,
Mhm.
that they live in lower socioeconomic, neighborhoods, or they have, their family doesn't grow up, they grow up poor.
Mhm.
They grow up with parents that are constantly struggling because
Mhm.
they're trying to figure out how am I going to keep a roof over our head? How am I going to keep food on the table?
It's just suffering after suffering
Suffering
after
after
we're just
suffering.
compounding that suffering, and that's kind of the place where law enforcement become involved much more, right?
Yeah.
When there's so much suffering, it's concentrated suffering in
Hmm.
these one places, and we see people that are really just under this immense amount of suffrage, right?
Hmm.
And they're just constantly dealing with that, and they don't have the ability to access resources and opportunities that kind of say, here's how you do that. And another point that you made was this is an evolutionary process, right?
Hmm.
Might be times where we're okay. I know
Hmm.
for myself, for my personal experience, there have been plenty of times in my life where I've been coping effectively,
Hmm.
and then there have been times where I'm not coping effectively,
Hmm.
right? And I'm practicing unhealthy maladaptive coping, and you go through those periods, right?
Hmm.
um, and I would agree with you, like it's just how much can you take, and at what point are you exposed to alternatives, information that says, "Oh,
Hmm.
I can choose a different way, or I can not participate in this." That
Yeah.
really leads to our ability to move out of that. But when you're talking about law enforcement involvement, you're not talking about this one singular suffering.
No, no. I mean, a lot of times, by the time we're getting called to that house to deal with that domestic where he threw his wife down on the ground, that's not the first time he's put his hands on her. It's
Right.
definitely not the first time they've argued.
Right.
I mean, let's be realistic. Any marriage, even
Yeah.
the best marriages,
Any
any
relationship.
relationship, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be arguing, right?
Mhm.
So, no, by the time, generally, so I would say majority of the time when we're responding to stuff like that, the disorderly juvenile,
Mhm.
the domestic violence case, to get a little extreme, the sex crime,
Mhm.
especially involving, child abuse, it's not the first time it's happened.
And there's an escalation too.
It's an escalation. Either the person has been going through it for so long that they no longer want to deal with it, and the only resource that they know they can reach out to is
Mhm.
law enforcement. And so we
Mhm.
get involved. Or it has gotten to such a volatile level that it explodes,
Mhm.
and now law enforcement are involved, or they've been doing that particular type of drug for years and years and years, and now they've gotten to a point where they're basically homeless, or they are homeless, and now they're committing crimes to support their habit, and now law enforcement is getting involved.
You bring up a really like that those examples are so powerful because what you're talking about, what you're highlighting is our ability to cope, right?
Hmm.
We can only handle so much
Hmm.
before something happens. And the examples that we've given is we can only handle so much of that suffering before change happens. And
Hmm.
that change can look like a lot of different things. That change could be law enforcement involvement. That change could be a violent act. That
Hmm.
change could be someone saying, "You know what? I'm not living like this anymore and I'm going to go into the Navy."
Hmm.
It could be anything, right, that's
Hmm.
within our purview. And that's the thing is the root of that is coping. The root of that is how much can one individual handle before
Mhm.
it comes to law enforcement, before it comes out. And that's the visible thing. That's what we see. We don't
Right.
see what's underlying. And I think that that's also important when we think about law enforcement as well. When behaviors become criminalized for law enforcement officers,
Mm.
when law enforcement officers cannot handle, and you pointed it out earlier, they can't handle not only their own personal suffering,
Mhm.
but the vicarious trauma that they're experiencing
Right.
with going into these calls for services. They're consuming that struggle. They're
Mhm.
consuming that suffering. And they're also dealing with another layer of that. They're dealing with the need and the desire as individuals, but also as law enforcement officers to want to fix. And when your
Mhm.
power is limited, right? When there's not much that you can do,
It's frustrating.
it really creates a lot of internal conflict for law enforcement
Mhm.
because they want to save, they want to fix, they want to help. That's the job you signed up to do,
Right.
right? You want to fix,
Yep.
but you're limited by the law. You're
Mhm.
limited by the evidence. You're limited by what's presented in front of you, and
Mhm.
you can only do so much. And so you're dealing with these three layers, right?
Right.
How much can one law enforcement officer take?
Well, and some of us take quite a bit. Some of
Yeah.
us take more than others. Some of us can't really handle it. And for me, I got to a point, I did crimes against children for 3.5 years as a detective. And what got me was the baby deaths.
Mhm.
Because, anytime a child dies, it's immediately suspicious,
Yeah.
right? Unless, of course, the child had a, diagnosed severe medical issue
Right.
and they're under care. Okay, obviously, and they're probably, unfortunately, probably pass in the hospital, or most of those. But, for the kid that, for the baby that just doesn't wake up,
Yeah.
right? That's going to be investigated um, as suspicious, at least until we can determine what happened with that kid. And so,
Mhm.
and I say all that just to say, I'm not saying I have investigated a whole bunch of child homicides, right? Usually, if it rises to the not usually, when it rises to the level of homicide, the homicide detectives actually take that investigation over, and then the crimes against children works as a support for them to
Mhm.
help them understand
That dynamic.
the dynamic and that
Yeah.
history. Like,
Yeah.
how do we get to here with this child, that the child is now
Yeah.
dead, right? And that empowers those detectives to do a better job at investigating. So,
Yeah.
but from my perspective, dealing with what might be considered accidental or maybe just negligent care, but I'm going to those autopsies.
Yeah.
So I'm watching, and I've watched 6 or 7 autopsies, and a couple of those were not my investigations; they were my trainees' investigations. So we're talking about piling on that vicarious trauma, right? So
Mhm.
not only am I dealing with my own calls, but now as a trainer, I'm also dealing with calls that I would not have had, except that I've got to help out my trainee
Yeah.
and make sure that they know what they're doing. And so, for me, that seventh one, Christmas Day of 2021, I got called in for one,
Mm.
and I was done. I said, you know what? This is enough.
Mhm.
So, but I'm fortunate enough to have developed enough coping skills to get to a point where I can recognize some of that stuff. And a lot of people, they don't have those. And it's something that we're trying to instill on these newer officers as they come in, so that we don't get to the point where we have officers committing policy violations. We don't have officers using excessive force. We don't have officers, you know,
Mhm.
illegally killing people, which
Yeah.
unfortunately we see way too
Mhm.
much. And I would contend and agree with most people that once is too many times.
Yeah.
And again, none of this is to justify any of that
Yeah.
behavior, but the reality is not every person that commits an evil act is evil in and of themselves.
Right.
They have problems. I'll a
Yeah.
minor example that happened recently. It was what I would call let's call it do nothing, but it was a very basic call that we had. It was a parking complaint, and people are just really upset because they've been dealing with it for years. The parking situation where they live is awful. and there are people taking advantage and violating like city ordinances and state statutes and things like that. And during the conversation, the officer snapped at one of the individuals they were talking to. He just spoke rudely to them. Didn't say what he said was not necessarily wrong. How he said it was.
Tone.
Right? His tone, and which upset that person's significant other. And now I'm getting called.
Yeah.
Right. And so now I got to go and try to, okay, do we have what we would call a true discourtesy complaint, or is this just, a miscommunication, or, what's going on? And so I figure it all out. And by the end of it, everybody's copacetic. Everybody's cool. The officer ended up going and apologizing to the individual that he snapped at, said, look, that was not my intention. I apologize. And to their credit, they ended up calling me later and saying, hey, look, this is what happened. Until we're able to calm down, they called later and say, this is what happened. Your officer was wrong the way that he acted when he initially arrived. But after you left, he finished doing what he had to do for the parking stuff. And then he came and he apologized to us. And we just wanted to say, we really appreciate that.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and as the person is telling me this, they also say, he's like, and I recognize, like, your officer is human. I don't know what type of day he's had. I don't know what's going on in his life. I was talking to him. I know he's got like 20 something years on the service. So I know he's been doing this for a long time. I don't know what he's got going on in his personal life, but he does need to be cognizant of it. And and I said, I agree. But I got all kinds of things going on in my background. But when I show up, I still need to be professional, and that's where those coping skills come in. So when we have these newer officers coming in, that's part of the training. We now have in the academy, I think there's like a whole day on mental health and stress management and whatnot, which personally they could probably use that a little bit more. We try to give a little bit, during the field training process as well. And then of course, as a mentor with my officers, I try to keep an eye on them. I try to talk to them so we don't get to the point we are blatantly violating policy, whether it be intentional or not. We're not making split decision seconds that violate people's rights because we had a bad day or because we're going through a nasty breakup or because we had a family member pass away recently. And because we're not dealing with those things effectively outside of the job, it's now affecting me in the job. While at the same time, I'm trying to deal with this couple who's going through a divorce and the husband just beat the crap out of the wife. Or this couple who both of them have a serious drug problem. And, we're having to arrest this one because he just robbed the store down the street. And now she has zero financial support because they've been supporting themselves by him going out and committing crimes. And so, and again, I'm not trying to justify anything that anybody does. Like, you still have a choice. And when you make a decision to act a certain way, there are consequences to those actions. But we do try to teach these officers their coping skills so they don't make mistakes, while at the same time teaching them, and this goes into us, teaching or treating people with human dignity, is by understanding, okay, yes, this person committed this bad, awful act, right? They're still a human being. And there is a very good chance that there is a plethora of crap that they've been through that we don't know about that brought them to this point. So we still got to treat them with some level of dignity, regardless of what they did. I did crimes against children for 3.5 years. It's not easy.
No,
it's not easy. But we have to recognize, that. And so we teach coping skills. We teach, you need to work out and take care of yourself. You need to eat right, get your sleep. There's nothing educationally that your listeners get from this. Get your sleep.
Sleep is foundational. Absolutely. And I think what ultimately what you're saying is on both sides of this, we're all human. We're all suffering. We're all dealing with whatever's going on in our lives, and our ability to cope predicates on whether or not we're on this side or that side of the justice system. And in order for us to really work at as a society, as a population, for us to really work at reducing suffering, reducing criminal justice involvement, is for us to really understand how to effectively cope with
Mhm.
what we're dealing with, because it's present. It's going to be there. We're going to
Mhm.
deal with suffering. We just have to learn effective coping mechanisms.
Yeah, whether that's exercise, therapy, your faith,
Yeah.
whatever it is. And but unfortunately, some people don't. They don't have the support system to
Mhm.
learn those, and so you know
Yeah.
it would be nice for us to figure out a way to get that, what I would call training,
Yeah.
to a a broader audience.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely agree. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And you're watching Justice Talks, and we'll see you next time.